Why the United States would need access to Venezuela oil reserves in the context of a possible future Iran-Israel war sits at the intersection of energy security, global power competition, military logistics, economic stability, and long-term geopolitical planning. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves in the world, even larger than Saudi Arabia's. Though much of this oil is heavy crude that requires advanced refining capacity. For decades, Venezuelan oil was a key component of U.S. energy imports, especially for refineries along the Gulf Coast that were specifically designed to process heavy crude from Venezuela. While U.S. domestic oil production has surged since the shale revolution, energy security for Washington has never been only about current production levels. It is about resilience under crisis, control of supply chains, and the ability to manage shocks during major wars or global disruptions. A future Iran-Israel war would almost certainly disrupt energy flows from the Middle East. Iran sits astride the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points in global energy trade. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow waterway. In a war scenario involving Iran and Israel, even if Israel were not directly blocking shipping lanes, Iran could respond by threatening or actually disrupting tanker traffic. Mines, missile attacks, drone strikes, or the mere perception of danger could send insurance rates for shipping through the roof, discouraging tankers from transiting the region. Even limited disruption could cause oil prices to spike dramatically, affecting not only U.S. consumers but the entire global economy. The United States has strategic petroleum reserves, but those are designed as a temporary buffer, not a long-term replacement for global supply disruptions. A prolonged conflict in the Middle East could last months or even years, especially if it expands to include Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, or direct U.S. involvement. In such a scenario, Washington would need alternative, reliable sources of oil that are geographically secure, politically manageable, and logistically efficient. Venezuela, located in the Western Hemisphere and close to U.S. shores, fits this strategic requirement better than almost any other country. Another critical factor is the quality and compatibility of Venezuelan oil with U.S. infrastructure. Many U.S. refineries, especially in Texas and Louisiana, were built or upgraded specifically to handle heavy sour crude like that from Venezuela and Canada. When Venezuelan supplies were cut off due to sanctions and political conflict, U.S. refiners had to seek alternatives, including Canadian oil sands crude and imports from the Middle East. In a future war involving Iran, Middle Eastern heavy crude could become scarce or politically sensitive, making Venezuelan oil even more valuable. From a purely technical and economic standpoint, restarting large-scale Venezuelan exports to the U.S. would be faster and more efficient than reconfiguring refineries or relying solely on lighter shale oil. Energy security is also deeply tied to military power. Modern warfare consumes vast amounts of fuel, not only for aircraft, naval vessels, and armored vehicles, but also for logistics, transportation, and industrial production. If the US were drawn into a regional war involving Iran and Israel, its military presence in the Middle East would likely expand significantly. Carrier strike groups, air bases, missile defense systems, and troop deployments all require a stable and massive supply of fuel. While much of this fuel could be sourced domestically, the US military also relies on global supply chains and allied contributions. Securing nearby oil sources in the Americas would reduce dependence on vulnerable supply routes and free up domestic production for civilian needs. Beyond the immediate military and economic considerations, Venezuela's oil reserves are part of a broader strategic competition involving China and Russia. Both countries have invested heavily in Venezuela over the past 2 decades. China has provided loans in exchange for future oil deliveries, while Russia has offered military support, energy investment, and political backing to the Venezuelan government. In a future global crisis triggered by a Middle Eastern war, Washington would be deeply concerned about Beijing or Moscow leveraging Venezuelan oil to their advantage. If China were able to secure preferential access to Venezuelan energy while the Middle East was destabilized, it could cushion its own economy from oil shocks while US allies in Europe and Asia suffered. Preventing such an outcome would be a strong incentive for the US to reassert influence over Venezuela's energy sector. The Iran-Israel dimension adds another layer. Israel does not possess large oil reserves and relies on stable global markets for energy. Although Israel has discovered offshore natural gas, in the Mediterranean, oil remains essential for global transportation and military operations. In a major war with Iran, Israel would depend heavily on US logistical, financial, and military support. The US, in turn, would want to ensure that global oil prices do not skyrocket to levels that could undermine domestic political stability or weaken allied economies. Venezuela's oil could serve as a stabilizing factor, increasing supply and helping to offset losses from the Persian Gulf. Sanctions policy also plays a role. Historically, the US has used sanctions as a tool to pressure adversaries like Iran and Venezuela. However, sanctions are not static. They are adjusted according to strategic needs. In recent years, Washington has shown flexibility by easing certain sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for political concessions or simply to stabilize oil markets during crises such as the Russia-Ukraine war. A future Iran-Israel conflict would likely prompt similar react. If Iranian oil were removed from the market due to war or sanctions enforcement, the US would need alternative sources to prevent a supply crunch. Venezuela would be one of the few countries with the potential capacity to significantly increase output if investment and political conditions allowed. Domestic US politics cannot be ignored. Sharp increases in gasoline prices have historically had major political consequences in the United States. Presidents and ruling parties often face public backlash when fuel prices rise, regardless of the underlying causes. In a scenario where a Middle Eastern war drives oil prices upward, the US government would be under immense pressure to act. Facilitating Venezuelan oil exports could be framed as a pragmatic step to protect American consumers, even if it meant engaging with a government Washington has long criticized. This kind of realpolitik has precedent throughout US history. Another important consideration is the long-term energy transition. While the US and its allies are investing heavily in renewable energy, electric vehicles, and alternative fuels, oil will remain central to the global economy for decades. Wars, especially large-scale interstate conflicts, tend to slow energy transitions because governments prioritize immediate security over long-term environmental goals. A future Iran-Israel war could delay climate targets and increase short-term demand for oil. In such an environment, having access to large untapped reserves like Venezuela's becomes even more strategically important. Venezuela's internal situation also factors into US calculations. Years of mismanagement, corruption, and sanctions have crippled the country's oil industry. Production has fallen far below its historical peak. However, the reserves remain in the ground. With sufficient investment, technology, and political stability, output could be significantly increased. From a US perspective, influencing Venezuela's political and economic trajectory could unlock these reserves at a time when they are most needed. This does not necessarily require direct military intervention. It could involve diplomacy, sanctions relief, support for negotiations, or cooperation with international oil companies. In the context of a future Iran-Israel war, the global order could become more polarized. Countries may be forced to choose sides or navigate a complex web of alliances and pressures. Energy producers will gain leverage, while energy importers will become more vulnerable. By securing access to Venezuelan oil, the US would not only protect itself, but also strengthen its ability to support allies in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. This could involve redirecting supplies, stabilizing markets, or using energy as a diplomatic tool to maintain coalition unity. There is also the issue of strategic depth. The US has long sought to prevent hostile powers from gaining a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a principle dating back to the Monroe Doctrine. A Venezuela aligned closely with Iran, Russia, or China during a global crisis would be seen as a strategic liability. Iran has already attempted to build ties with Venezuela, including fuel shipments, technical cooperation, and political solidarity against US sanctions. In a wartime scenario, such relationships could deepen, potentially allowing Iran to offset some of the economic impact of conflict. From Washington's viewpoint, limiting Iran's global partnerships would be an important objective, and energy diplomacy with Venezuela could be part of that effort. Finally, the psychological and symbolic dimensions matter. Control over energy resources has always been a marker of global power. In times of war, perceptions of strength, preparedness, and resilience can shape outcomes as much as battlefield realities. demonstrating that the US can weather a major Middle Eastern conflict without economic collapse would reinforce its global leadership. Venezuelan oil, while only one piece of a much larger puzzle, could contribute to that perception by ensuring stable supplies and manageable prices. In sum, the idea that the United States would need Venezuela as oil reserves in the context of a future Iran-Israel war is rooted not in a single motive but in a convergence of strategic concerns. These include the vulnerability of Middle Eastern supply routes, the need for compatible heavy crude for U.S. refineries, the demands of modern warfare, competition with China and Russia, domestic political pressures, and the broader goal of maintaining global economic stability. Venezuela's vast oil reserves represent a form of strategic insurance, a potential buffer against chaos in one of the world's most volatile regions, in a future defined by uncertainty, conflict, and shifting alliances. Such insurance could prove invaluable.